One. Hi, welcome to the China-MENA newsletter. Another one of the video conversations, another one focusing on Iran. I'm really happy today to be joined by Thomas Juneau, who is a professor at the University of Ottawa's Graduate School of Public and International Affairs. Thomas covers a lot of different territory in his work. He's a national security expert, national intelligence expert. He does Middle East, he does Houthis, but for the purpose of today, he does a lot of great work on Iranian foreign policy. Tomas, thanks for doing this.
Thanks for having me.
No, it's great. It's like I was saying, it's always fun to catch up with things like this. So it's been an eventful couple of weeks for those of us who are watching the world. And it's been also, I think, just, in addition to all the normal stuff, you've got the abnormal stuff that's happening in the Middle East. And I think for Iran, I imagine the world looks a little differently than it did, say, 2 years ago. How do you think decision makers in Iran's foreign policy establishment are looking at the landscape right now? The regional situation has changed really dramatically for them. You know, Hezbollah is in terrible shape, and Hamas is in terrible shape, and Israel's kind of removed their deterrence capacity. At the global level, you've got President-elect Trump coming back in soon. Looking at all this, do you think they're thinking this is there room to wiggle around, or are they feeling pretty constricted? What's your take?
Well, I mean, in a way, both, in the sense that I do think that Iran has had a very bad 2024, and restrictions on their margin of maneuver, which were already important, which I think we often underestimate in Iran's case,
Yeah.
but they've gotten even worse. That being said, they still have room to wiggle, as you said. And Iran, if anything, if there's one thing that we've learned in the last 20 years or more, it's that they can still be pretty good and pretty adept at playing a bad deck of cards, and managing to find a way to at the very least survive as a regime, and make a bad situation maybe not as bad as it could be. Bad year in 2024. I mean, Hamas has been devastated. It's not dead, but it's, the main pressure point that they have on the Palestinian side seriously weakened. Hezbollah, not as seriously weakened as Hamas, but weakened. Leadership decapitation, a significant proportion of their missile and rocket depots have been destroyed. And psychologically, Hezbollah has been weakened. And I
Yeah.
think that matters a lot. I mean, their reputation has taken a serious hit. That's a hit for Iran because Hezbollah is the crown jewel, right? And as you said, the direct confrontations that we saw in April and October between Iran and Israel have resulted in serious losses for Iran. Physically, materially, their air defenses have been seriously weakened, which leaves Iran extremely vulnerable for future confrontations with Israel or the United States. Iran obviously knows this. That seriously ties their hands. And again, psychologically, the defeat has been as important as the military or material one, in the sense that Iran lobbed 200 ballistic missiles at Israel in October, did minimal damage. Israel's very advanced air defenses and its alliances were able to defend themselves. And on the other hand, Israel basically walked in, went over Syrian and Iraqi airspace, and surgically destroyed Iranian air defenses, also crucial bottlenecks in their missile production facilities, and a nuclear site that was apparently, according to media reports, not important or not very important. But again, it's the psychological message here, which is we can go in and do this. So, I mean, I could go on for a long time. I'll stop here. But the bottom line is that Iran has had a very bad year, and they know this. This seriously constrains their future options. And Trump coming in now in early 25 makes for even more bad news in many ways because it will be so unpredictable.
Yeah, but one thing we can predict, because he said, right after the election, is that he wants to return to maximum pressure, which I lived in the Gulf during maximum pressure round one. It wasn't comfortable, you know,
Yeah.
even on the sidelines here. It was really, really unpredictable, and Iran painted it into a corner, behaved very aggressively. And I worry about this happening. Do you think this, you could hear the rhetoric from the previous Trump administration, especially former Secretary of State Pompeo, who would talk a lot about regime change, which I think makes a lot of folks here uncomfortable because, there's been some experience with that. in the not too distant past, and it's never gone as well as people anticipate. Um, or do you think this is just setting the foundation for some kind of a deal? Because obviously they're so famous about going for deals in the
Uh,
Trump administration.
the bottom line is that I don't know. And that's what I mean by unpredictability. I think you're right to say that we can be very confident that in the early stages of the Trump administration, there will be a return to maximum pressure. Will it be as intense? Will it be more intense than in Trump 1? Hard to say because there will be a lot of other priorities elsewhere in the world, China, tariffs, Ukraine. There will be a simple bandwidth issue that will make this hard for the Trump administration to manage, but there will be a stronger set of approaches to pressure Iran for sure, and that will make the Gulf uncomfortable, which wants that pressure, but maybe not too much of it. Right? There's always that difficult balance.
Yeah.
Um, what is the end goal of maximum pressure? That's where I think we don't know what the answer is, and I think we don't know because it's not been said, and because there's a lot of different perspectives around Trump. There are some people around Trump for who maximum pressure is the end, i.e., we just want to suffocate Iran as much as possible, perhaps leading to regime change, or if not, at least to suffocation and just weakening Iran as much as possible. And that's the point. And that, as you say, it can be dangerous because Iran will not take it lying down. It will respond, even if, as I said in the previous question, its options are constrained. It's still Iran. It still has access to a lot of pressure points on the US, on Israel, and on the Gulf, and it will use them. It will not take this lying down. That can be dangerous. I don't think we're at a point where the regime is on the verge of collapse. We're still pretty far
Right.
from that. But who knows what can happen in 4 years? There's still a lot of discontent in Iran. If you add a lot of maximum pressure on the economy, on the society, where can that go? That will make a lot of people nervous because, as you hinted at, the idea of regime change is based on a fantasy that there is an alternative that is just waiting on the sidelines to replace what is a brutal, corrupt, violent regime, but there's nothing to replace it. So
Yeah.
the fall of the regime would be extraordinarily violent and complex and not fun. Um, but then there's another school of thought that says the end goal here for the Trump administration is to use maximum pressure as a means to an end, which is a deal. And there are people in the Trump administration who advocate for that. We saw Musk going to meet the Iranians in New York just a few days ago. Not clear exactly what was said, but reportedly that could be in support of that theory. Um, that will be difficult because it's not clear to me that there is a common ground where Iran and the Trump administration can meet. I mean, the Trump administration will ask for a lot, right? Much more than what came up in the JCPOA almost 10 years ago now.
Mm.
Stopping support for violent groups and so on in exchange for lifting of sanctions, including the new sanctions that I have no doubt the Trump administration will impose. Can an Islamic Republic, being as hardline as it is now, accept these demands? I'm seriously skeptical. So the danger here is that even if some kind of deal is or ends up being the objective of a new Trump administration, is it feasible? Hard. And if it's not, and the effort fails, where does that take us? Very possibly to a nasty place.
We were talking about revolution in my comparative politics class recently, and there are no shortage of examples to draw on. And we talked about regime change in Iran, and like a lot of my students, Emirati students, who are very uncomfortable with the Islamic Republic of Iran, like the idea of a different government in place, of course. But then when we looked at the case of Egypt, after 2011, when you don't have a vibrant civil society, when you don't have a lot of different groups that have a legitimate claim to governance, what happens in Iran? I think what you see is the only really sturdy institution is the military. If you replace the Ayatollah, you might get the IRGC saying, "Okay, we're the guys that have to do it." So, is this really the ideal situation?
These are really hard questions, and these are questions that will only come up more and more in the coming years and decades if you really take the long view, because the Islamic Republic, like I said, it's not about the fall, but it is under significant regional but also domestic pressure. Discontent is mounting. The economy is really struggling. So these questions will come up. Uh, what are the alternatives? And the comparison with Egypt is obviously interesting and relevant. There is more of a civil society in Iran. It's been heavily repressed, but there are movements, organizations, and individuals who constitute inklings of more of a civil society. But there's no opposition in an
Yeah.
organized way. There's certainly no opposition in exile. And one of the lessons of the last 2 years is that those groups claiming to be in opposition in exile, the MEK, the monarchists, are really not the groups you want to, as the US and as Western governments to support as viable alternatives, because they're not. So is the main scenario basically a steady expansion of IRGC power, either gradually or suddenly? That has to be one of the main outcomes that we think about. And then the next question is, okay, but then what happens? What would an IRGC dominated Iran look like in terms of its foreign policy? It would be very nationalist. It
Mm.
would obviously not be democratic at all, like not even close. Would it be less ideologically hostile to the US and Israel? Possibly. There is a case to be made at that level, but it would not be good news for Iran's neighbors, for example. I mean, this would be a very hardline, nationalist, ambitious government in terms of its foreign policy.
Yeah. As you're describing the regional domestic pressures, I was just thinking about the fortune that has been squandered by Iran, by propping up Hezbollah, by pouring money into Hamas. Like, domestic constituents have to be looking at this right now and saying, I think I saw today Hamas, Hezbollah's lost something like 4,000 people, far more than 2006. I think it was like, I can't remember what factor it was, but it was a significantly larger factor. Like, just to think all this money that we could have been building better schools, building hospitals, building a tech sector, like, you're throwing all of our money into this stuff. Like, there's got to be just tremendous discontent.
Oh, absolutely. And one of the tragedies of the Islamic Republic is how much better Iran could be in
Yeah,
terms of its wealth, in terms of its power, in terms of its security, if it had not squandered all of its resources in this ideologically misguided foreign policy that ultimately has been a catastrophe for Iranians, right? Sanctions, economic mismanagement, but also for the country's security. And that, in a way, goes back to one of the point that I mentioned at the very beginning, when I said that we often underestimate the constraints under which Iran operates. I mean, Iran is a very much of an isolated country. It doesn't have state friends in the region, if you put aside Syria, but that's a complicated
right.
case for many reasons. And now its non-state partners, Hamas and Hezbollah, are really struggling. Obviously, there's the exception of the Houthis, which are the big exception to this story. They have been on the rise. They have been increasingly valuable to Iran as part of the axis of resistance. They are the one good news story, I think, for Iran in the past year. But there's a limit to the benefits that they can bring to Iran from a security perspective, right?
I'm sorry, I'm laughing because I've never heard the Houthis referred to as the one good news story before. So,
In
you
a
know,
very narrow sense, I think that's
in
true.
a yeah,
Yeah,
there's context, but we'll
yeah,
we'll forget the context. I'll just put like the headline of the stories. Juneau, the Houthis, the good news story.
yeah.
Um, just looking more, I mean, one thing I always enjoy talking with you because you're just so much deeper on Iranian domestic affairs than me, and there's always this tension, I think, between the idea that, presidents or political leaders have some kind of authority or the Ayatollah has all the authority. And, we saw when Mohammad Javad Zarif left office before the Raisi administration shortly came in, he gave that interview that was leaked where he said basically anything I tried to do diplomatically was undermined by the
Yeah.
national security apparatus. And it kind of fed into this idea that it doesn't really make a real difference who the president is or who his team is. What's your take on that? Do you think, like, again, returning to this idea that there might be a deal to be made with the US, or that might be the logic here? Would Pezeshkian be in a better position to do this because he's kind of seen as a reformer, or do you think it all comes down to what the Ayatollah wants?
I think it's somewhere in between, but closer to what the supreme leader wants. The way that I see it is that the president who's elected, not in a completely free and fair election, of course, makes a tactical difference. So whether the president is a reformist, a moderate like Rouhani was before, or a hardliner like Raisi was until his death, it makes a tactical difference. So to say that it makes no difference, I would disagree. But to say that it makes a big difference, which few people actually say, but those who do, it's clearly mistaken. Right now, what I find interesting is that Pezeshkian, the president, who's a reformist in the Iranian context, of course,
Right.
there's a bit of a good cop, bad cop routine that is going on, which is not a coincidence. In the sense that Pezeshkian in the last few days and some people around him have been making very conciliatory noise towards the US. We are interested in making a deal. They have said that they are ready to discuss some things with the IAEA. There is going to be a dialogue between Iran and the EU coming up soon, right? And that's again Pezeshkian showing this more conciliatory face. The Pezeshkian side of the administration has, you know, encouraged the notion of a ceasefire in Lebanon, right? Which is not a coincidence because they want Hezbollah to stop getting beaten down, obviously. But at the same time, on the supreme leader's side, you see tweets and other declarations taking the usual hardliner position of, resistance and death to the US and death to Israel and so on. That's not mutually exclusive, right? Right now, in the same way that we were saying a few minutes ago, that the forthcoming Trump administration will do maximum pressure with the possibility, very uncertain, but of going for a deal after that. That's what Iran is doing too. That good cop, bad cop routine of sending signals that we are open to talks, which they are. Pezeshkian would not say that without the supreme leader's approval. Iran is seriously suffering from sanctions, so it wants to be open to the notion of sanctions relief. It's getting close to being existential for them. But at the same time, there are a lot of ideological elements in the regime who do not want to make a deal. There are also a lot of hardliner elements in the regime who are not theoretically opposed to a deal, but they simply don't trust the US for being able to make one. So that good cop, bad cop routine is the reverse image of what the US is doing in terms of preparing the grounds on their own side.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the difficulty in getting people to get too excited about a deal with the US after, the pullout of the JCPOA, right?
Yeah.
Which that could be a whole other conversation because I have a lot of thoughts about that one. Just, that the Trump administration was trying to negotiate with North Korea at the same time that they were undermining the deal with Iran, probably didn't establish a lot of trust in Pyongyang. So a little bit out of your comfort zone, I have to ask about, we're talking a little bit about foreign policy, obviously China and a little bit Russia. In this situation, like you said, where Iran's regional partnerships are pretty limited in what they're able to deliver, I think there's always this expectation that, the Russia, China, Iran axis, if which I hate that framing, but we hear it a lot. This idea that these three revisionist powers are going to cooperate more. I posted something on the Substack today. There were two different stories about Iran. One where the Middle East envoy from China, Zhaijun, was basically urging the Iranians not to, compromise the ceasefire. And it was interesting to me that he felt he had to do that publicly because obviously there's a concern that Iran might violate the ceasefire and make things worse on the Chinese side, which kind of indicates to me that Beijing doesn't really have a lot of faith in Iran's, foreign policy objectives in the region. And then there was a story about, just how dependent Iranians are on Chinese, the economy for oil exports and the massive discounts that they've been giving to China. And the quote from somebody, a think tanker in Tehran was, this is like a colonial trap from the 19th century. So what you get is on both sides, I think, especially looking at China, Iran, China looks at Iran as a pretty difficult partner, problematic actor that undermines a lot of its interests. Iran looks at China as always the weaker side in an asymmetric relationship with a lot of resentment and frustration. What do you think? Do you expect in this kind of difficult foreign policy situation Iran is in, are they going to be working more closely with countries like Russia and China? Are they going to try something else with their good neighborly policy? What's your outlook?
I mean, I think you summarized it very well. I think Iran wants more out of these relations, Russia, China, East in general, because it has been shut out so much from the Western side because relations with neighbors remain difficult. Yes, there's a certain stabilization of relations with the UAE and Saudi Arabia in particular, but there's a fairly low ceiling in my view to how far, how high that can go. We probably haven't reached that ceiling, but it's not very far.
Mm.
There has been consistent frustration on the Iranian side as that it can't get more out of its relations with Russia and China. I would say, taking a step back, that I have revisited my view of the Iran-Russia relation in the sense that for years I was very skeptical that there was much potential for that relation to go deeper. And for years, I mean going back 20 years. And I worked in the Canadian government until 2014 before becoming a prof. And my view back in those years was no, there's really a low ceiling to how much Iran and Russia can go to. I remember the whole difficult discussions on the S-300, the then
Yeah.
advanced air defense systems that it took years for Russia to Iran's great frustration to deliver. But then two things happened, Syria and now Ukraine, which have brought Russia and Iran closer. So I have revisited the height of the ceiling of the potential for that partnership. It is higher than I used to see it, but I think there is still a ceiling, and we still see areas where that tension is right underneath. On the China side, I think you said it very well. Iran would want a lot more from this relationship, but China is being very careful, in my view, and you understand the Chinese perspective way better than I do, but I've always worked on the framework that China is very careful not to put too many eggs in the Iranian basket because it wants to make sure that it can achieve objectives with Saudi Arabia, UAE, and to a lesser extent Kuwait and others in the region, and it views the potential gains from these relations as in some ways higher than what it can get from Iran because Iran is such a difficult partner, as you said, because of the sanctions from the US, but also which does limit a number of things on the financial and trade side, but also because Iran is just a very difficult and unpredictable partner, period. The investment climate, the business climate inside Iran is very difficult in many ways. Protectionism, corruption, mismanagement, difficult regulatory and climate, not sympathetic to foreign investment, and so on. So on the Chinese side, there is a clear limit, I think, to how far they can go. And I think a lot of people, especially in the US, kind of freaked out when there was this famous agreement 2.5 years ago that
Right.
China allegedly brokered between China and Saudi Arabia. I think by me, I mean collectively, tend to have made way too much out of that than what it actually was. Iran and Saudi Arabia perceived a common interest in better managing tensions, not in reconciling. That is absolute nonsense. And they basically, at the last minute, and I'm simplifying here, but perceived a common interest in bringing China on board as a way to everybody poke the US in the eye for different reasons. But ultimately, China's role here was, I think, real, but limited.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. One of these talks I did last month was with an Iranian PhD candidate in Australia right now, and she wrote a paper on this that was really good. I recommend you check it out. I'll send you a link. But basically, she just
Yep.
kind of that was her take as well, is that, people have put a way too much weight on what China was able to do in this. Obviously, the Omanis and the Iraqis were the big players, and
Yes,
domestic considerations and
absolutely.
regional
Yeah.
considerations pretty much drove everything from the Saudi and the Iranian side. And China just got a nice little gift that fell into its lap, and said, "Well, thank you very much."
Yeah.
Um, well, hey, Thomas, this has been fun, and it's been really useful, really informative. I think the people who watch this are going to take a lot from it. Thanks so much for doing it.
Thanks for having me.
Anytime, man. This is always great for me.
Hope to see you soon.
Inshallah.